Now let's talk about dummy coding and regression equations. So again, let's use our example of interpreting or predicting conservative values from what region of the country you're from. And I should make a point here that all of the numbers I'm using today are completely made up. They're coming from a completely different data set that has nothing to do with anything we're doing. I'm just using them in this way because I think it helps with the interpretation. So all these numbers are completely made up. They have absolutely nothing to do with conservative values and where you might be from a region. I suspect that there might be some predictive value there, but I have no idea what it is. I'm not a political scientist. But let's talk about our regression equation. Right, so our typical regression equation, right, y hat, or predicted value of y, b sub 0 plus b1 x1 plus b2 x2, all the way out to whatever. So in this case, conservative, our expected conservative values would be b sub 0 plus a coefficient for each one of our dummy codes, our dummy variables. Right, so I have a b1 for being from the northeast, times being from the northeast, plus b2 times being from the south, plus b3 times being from the Midwest. Again, being from the west is our reference variable here, and so it's not included in our regression equation. So let's consider what happens if I'm from the northeast. Right? If I'm from the northeast, now remember, if I was going to code that person, right, I have northeast, south, and Midwest. So for that person, being from the northeast, they get a 1. Being from the south, they get a 2. Being from the 0. Being from the Midwest, they get a 0. These are their values on those variables. So let's plug that in. Being from the northeast, you get a 1. Being from the south, you get a 0. Being from the Midwest, you get a 0. So in that case, this goes to 0, this value goes to 0, and we ended up with just these two variables. So for our northeast group, it turns out that our expected value of y for our people from the northeast is equal to b sub 0 plus b sub 1. And that's it, right? Because northeast is a 1. So this is our expected value of conservative values for anyone from the northeast. And it turns out that this is just then the mean of that group. Remember when we first started talking about regression, we talked about how the mean is our best predictor for where one is, right? And for what our value of y is. So the mean of being from the northeast here is b sub 0, our intercept, plus the coefficient for that dummy code. In the same way, the predicted value for conservative values if you're from the south is equal to b sub 0 plus b sub 2. And b sub 0 plus b sub 2 then ends up being the mean for the group from the south. If you're from the Midwest, it's b sub 0 plus b sub 3. This is the mean for people from the Midwest. That's the mean for that group of conservative values. And these are our three. We also have our expected value of being from the West is just the y-intercept. The y-intercept here is the mean value for our reference group. In other words, being from the northeast, in order to calculate your expected value, it's the reference group mean plus whatever difference there is between the reference group and the northeast group. Being from the south, it's the reference group mean plus whatever the difference is between being from the reference group and being from the south. And then being from the Midwest, it's again the reference group mean plus whatever the difference in means is for being from the Midwest. And then our predicted value, if you're from the Midwest or from the West, our reference group, then it's just the y-intercept. So our regression coefficients then is how far are above or below the mean of the reference group the mean is for that dummy code, for whichever one it is, right? So we interpret B1 here as the difference between, in conservative values, the difference between being from the reference group and being from the Northeast. For B2, we interpret that as the difference between being from the reference group and being from the south. And for B3, we could interpret that as the difference in means between being from the reference group or being from the Midwest. Those are the interpretations for each of our regression coefficients here. It's all about the reference group. And so we want to keep that in mind when we're choosing the reference group. This is how we calculate the means. I will just throw in, we can also calculate the standard deviations when we use dummy code. And that is 100% related to the proportion of the group that's in that particular group, the proportion of the sample that's in that group. So we want to be very careful with our sampling because that's really going to determine our standard deviations. Standard deviation in dummy coding is 100% based on the proportions of the sample in each of the dummy codes. And so we want to be really careful about how we sample and try and sample as evenly across all of the dummy codes as we can because that's going to have effect on our standard deviations, which then is going to have an effect on our interpretations of R and our T values. So if I'm going to add some numbers to this, that was just an aside about standard deviations. If I was going to add some numbers to this equation, and again, made up numbers here, but if I was going to say that y hat, our conservative values here, is equal to 93.31 minus 42.64 times northeast plus 10.19 times being from the south, there's a little asterisk there for times, minus 23.18 times being from the Midwest, right? Again, I would interpret these as the mean difference from the reference group. I would say that the mean for our reference group, the mean conservative value of being for those in the West is 93.31. The mean conservative values for being from the Northeast is that Western group, 93.31 minus 42.46, right? So it's lower. Here we would interpret the conservative values of being from the Northeast lower than those of being from the West. Likewise, we could interpret being from the South, the mean, the average value of their conservative values, the average is actually higher than our reference group. So it's the reference group plus this, so it's 103 point something is our mean conservative values for the southern group, as opposed to 93 point something is our mean conservative values for being from the West. So again, when we interpret our regression coefficients here, it's always in reference to our reference value.